Good morning. Today we're going to be giving a short presentation on President John F. Kennedy. President from 1961 until 1963. Okay. President Kennedy first gets into presidential politics here with the election of 1960, in which he runs against Richard Nixon. One of the closest elections in American history, and was the closest since 1884. He defeats President Nixon by fewer than 119,000 votes. This is President Kennedy here, and would-be President Nixon. Some facts you may not know about President Kennedy. He was a decorated naval officer in World War II. Received the Pulitzer Prize for his book Profiles in Courage. He served exactly 1,000 days in office. Was the first president born in the 20th century and also the youngest president ever elected. He's also the only Roman Catholic president to be elected, and was a speed reader, which I'm sure helped him in going through all the documents he had to do as president. President Kennedy's inaugural address. Here you can see him in his inaugural address here. As we mentioned earlier, was the youngest person ever to be elected. Let the word go forth, the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This is a famous quotation by President Kennedy at his inauguration, which kind of kick-started a younger generation of Americans getting involved in politics. President Kennedy's years in office were known as the Camelot years. They're known as the royalty of American politics here. His young wife, Jackie, and his two children, Carolyn and John Jr. here. One of his first crises, almost immediately after he took office, was a crisis in Cuba with Fidel Castro. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, he openly declared himself a communist and a threat to the United States of America. You can see here Cuba is located just a short distance from Florida, and they were receiving aid from the Soviet Union, a communist enemy of the United States. The Bay of Pigs, on the nights of April 17, 1961, 1,500 Cuban exiles supported by the U.S. military landed on the island at the Bay of Pigs. The CIA and these exiles hoped it would trigger a mass uprising that would overthrow Fidel Castro and kind of reclaim Cuba as an American, a place that Americans could be safe and resecure the area. It didn't. Cuban forces backed by Soviet tanks and jet aircraft easily repelled the exile invasion. Many of them were killed, imprisoned, and it was a bad start for President Kennedy. Shortly later, in October of 1962, President Kennedy faced the Cuban Missile Crisis. Photographs were taken by American spy planes revealing that nuclear sites were being readied in Cuba, and these sites could be, as you can see here, could reach most of the East Coast here and posed a threat to millions of Americans. October 22nd, Kennedy orders a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent the further delivery of Soviet weapons. Blockade is where you surround the island with naval ships to prevent anything from going in or out. He also demands that Soviets remove the missiles. Khrushchev, who is the Soviet Union leader, promises to challenge the blockade, calling it outright banditry, and you have a face-off between two of the strongest nations in the world. For a few days, nuclear war and destruction was a possibility for all Americans. They were encouraged to take precautions, to have provisions. Many people went into bomb shelters, which were popular in the 1960s. And for several days, people really thought that the end of the world may have been just off the horizon. President Kennedy, deep in thought. Suddenly, October 24th, many of the Soviet ships stopped on the short of the blockade line, turned and sailed home. The famous quote by Secretary of State Dean Rusk, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think they just blinked. Khrushchev agrees to dismantle the missile bases in response to Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba and to remove missile sites that we had in Turkey. The next crisis that Kennedy faces is Berlin. One of the high points is his trip to Berlin in 1963 to show his commitment to West Berlin and West Germany. At that speech, he electrifies an audience of 150,000 Germans by stating, "Ich bin ein Berliner," in his attempt to say, "I am a Berliner," thus declaring the solidarity of all the free people in the world against the communist tyranny. He's known as the the creator of the New Frontier. Many of his legislative programs, he wanted to create medical care for the elderly, to rebuild some of the urban areas that have been destroyed or neglected, to aid education, to bolster national defense, to increase international aid. He wanted the United States to be a country that other nations could depend on. And he is credited with kickstarting the American space program. He also provided volunteer assistance to developing nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and a promoter of civil rights. In fall of '63, public opinion polls showed Kennedy was losing popularity because of his advocacy of civil rights. November 22nd, 1963, President and Mrs. Kennedy went to Texas to mend political fences with the state's Democratic Party. Crowds lined the streets to greet the president. The governor of Texas, John Connally, is in the front here with President Kennedy and his wife in the back. As the car approached a state building known as the Texas School Book State Depository, or a library, rifle shots rang out. Kennedy is shot in the head. His car races to a nearby hospital where they try to revive him, but unfortunately President Kennedy is dead. In 1963, the Warren Commission, a commission created after the assassination of the president, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald here had shot the president while acting on his own. Since then, there's been all sorts of conspiracy theories dealing with this, but this is the official conclusion that they came up with. We never got a chance to put Lee Harvey Oswald on trial or to question him because 2 days later, as he's being arraigned or transferred between two different areas, Jack Ruby pops out of a crowd and shoots and kills him in the stomach. So both the person who was shot and the person here, Jack Ruby, who dies in prison several years later, never get a chance to answer questions too much as to why they did it, what happened, and we're left with the mystery. But ultimately, President Kennedy should be remembered for his short time in office as a great communicator. Somebody who was able to get Americans, and especially young Americans, involved in politics and helped us avert several crises that could have been very, very bad to the United States. Thank you, and I hope this has been helpful.